Curran.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I want to talk about this government's incompetence and its deceit. Its incompetence in running the economy and the incompetence of ministers in their portfolios, because some ministers don't even seem to understand what their portfolios mean, let alone grasp what their responsibilities are. This bill sets out the government's spending and revenue raising plans for the year ahead, and it gives Parliament authority for those activities to take place. But this government isn't going to address the big issues on the economy. The budget doesn't do that. It's petty, it's short-sighted, and it's just plain dumb and nasty in parts, and it's certainly not providing any new ideas to grow the economy. The only idea that this government has is asset sales, and that's proving to be a great idea, isn't it? Last year, John Key promised 170,000 new jobs. Instead, we've got a government with the worst growth record in 50 years, with more than 50,000 people leaving for Australia, 52% in unemployment, and nearly 50,000 more on benefits. So let me tell you what the Minister of Economic Development, the great Mr Stephen Joyce, said to the Commerce Select Committee last week when he was put on the spot around those jobs. This is the economic hard man of this government, the guy who gets things done. He's the Machiavelli who pulls the strings in the back rooms. Well, let me tell you, and the chair of the Select Committee, who sits across the House there, he was there, he heard what he had to say. He couldn't make a case. He floundered. He couldn't make a case to back up his Prime Minister's ridiculous pledge to create 170,000 jobs, because there is no case. Instead, Kiwis are going out the back door in droves. They're flying out, and they'd be leaving by the boatload if the seas weren't so rough. So this is what he said. When he was asked what his forecasts were in job growth in the different sectors to make up that 170,000 and how he was tracking them relative to job growth targets, he said, quote, "Well, actually, we're making some very good progress. We're very comfortable that with that 170,000 job target. And in terms of where they're coming from, well, naturally, they're coming from a range of areas, and right across the economy you're seeing significant growth in the number of vacancies." But when asked on estimates, what work the department's done, the ministry's done on a region by region, sector by sector for that job growth, well, no, we haven't done that, he said. Now, they've had a year to do it. A whole year to do that, to give some kind of analysis on where those jobs are coming from. Where are they coming from? When asked how many have actually been created, he couldn't tell us. He couldn't tell us, and that's because he just simply doesn't know. And that's because, as with all the other targets that this government has announced, particularly the targets that they've announced this week, they just don't know. They're meaningless. They're meaningless targets that can't be backed up, and essentially they're trying to pull the wool over the eyes of New Zealanders and tell us a great big story. And then there's the pettiness and incompetence of other ministers. The petty, stupid, misguided decisions that are going to have long-term implications for our country, implications that will have long-term effects for our nation. And the biggest, apart from asset sales, the other big issue that's happening this week is the decision by this government to axe funding for TVNZ7, which is our only public broadcast channel, which was removed, the funding which was removed from this year's budget, a big blank line for this year's budget. Have you? Maybe the minister hasn't actually read the budget, because he doesn't seem to have read his cabinet papers or a lot of other papers, or even understand what his job is. It was removed from this year's budget, and it will have huge long-term effects on this country. And then you'd think that Peter Dunn, the great champion of public broadcasting, would have made just a bit more of an effort when he negotiated a deal with this government?
He's just a planker.
Well, you would have thought that he would have made a bit more of an effort. In the briefing to the incoming Minister of Broadcasting in December, it was mentioned that the, quote, the confidence and supply agreement between National and United Future New Zealand, the national-led government, has agreed to maintain at least current budget funding tracks to TVNZ, ... to ensure they continue to fulfil their existing broadcasting roles. Well, apart from the fact that that's a meaningless sentence, quite meaningless sentence, you would have thought that given that he was such a supporter of public broadcasting, he rolls out onto the steps of Parliament to speak at the rallies. Whenever there's a rally about public broadcasting, out comes Peter Dunn, championing the cause. If he was such a supporter, as he claims to be, why didn't he make his support for asset sales legislation contingent on ongoing funding for TVNZ7? Why couldn't he have insisted? Instead, the country gets its energy companies sold off to overseas interests and we lose public broadcast television, all in the same week. What a great legacy that is. It was a Labour government that allocated $79 million for channels TVNZ6 and TVNZ7. It was a Labour government that had the intention of continuing public broadcasting in New Zealand, and it's a future Labour government that remains committed to public broadcasting in New Zealand and will reinstitute it. And as was revealed, Mr. Speaker, it's just plain deceit to say, as the Minister of, well, he calls himself the Minister of Broadcasting, said yesterday that somehow it was never the intention to do it. And this was revealed in today's Dominion Post, where it was shown through an official information request document that there was a plan on the table, that there was a plan to keep TVNZ7 going, and it was this government that axed it. It was this government that made the deliberate decision to exit. Oh, and the Minister of Broadcasting shakes his head. But as he revealed yesterday, he doesn't even read the Cabinet papers. He doesn't actually know what happened last year when he wasn't the Minister, because somehow maybe he thinks that only his job started as of December and he didn't need to know what actually happened before that. So it's plain incompetence, Mr. Speaker, plain incompetence. And when they put Craig Foss in as the Minister of Broadcasting, the Minister of Fumbling and Bumbling, who doesn't understand his brief, doesn't read his Cabinet papers, who allowed Stephen McElroy, the Prime Minister's electric chair, to continue on the board of New Zealand On Air, making decisions with public money for commercial purposes, for programs that are purely advertising related and that suit the government's agenda. That's what this Minister of Public Broadcasting does, and who doesn't even realise that he's got the power to approve spectrum allocation for public purposes, because he is actually the Minister for Broadcasting and he does actually have the power to approve spectrum allocation for public purposes, but who didn't seem to realise that yesterday either, that he won't. And instead, maybe he could actually answer a few more questions on this, because he obviously hasn't read the framework where his policy actually states that he is required to promote local broadcasting services, to promote innovation and digital broadcasting. Perhaps he could answer the questions as to whether the Ministry of Culture and Heritage and the Ministry of Economic Development reserved any spectrum for the purposes of non-commercial television broadcasters that seek to leave that void that had been left by Television New Zealand 6 and Television New Zealand 7, that has been axed in the latest budget, axed forever by this government. And And perhaps he should be asking himself and asking for some advice from his ministry on whether there has been any effort to determine if other broadcasters are prepared to broadcast the non-commercial program services, and if they do, what is he going to do? What is he going to do? And how are those new non-commercial broadcasters, how are those new non-commercial broadcasters going to fill the void left by TVNZ 6 and 7?
Dr. Jian Yang.
Mr. Speaker, it is a privilege to be given the opportunity to speak on the appropriation bill.